let me go take it farther. If someone is not Christian and someone says, well, I appreciate Orthodoxy, but there are just things that I just can't hold on to, I can't believe because I'm just, I'm very progressive. Or one might say there are these certain conservative ideals that I hold on to that I just don't see that. I think the church should be stronger about these things. Right? That's because you have an idol that you want to keep in your closet. It's like Israel saying, I want to follow the God of Israel, but can I keep my Baal statue in case we have a drought?
Welcome. Thank you for listening. We live in a culture dominated by psychology, science, and instantaneous global journalism, which make us paranoid about our physical fitness, fanatical about our ideology, and completely ignorant of who we were created to be and how we can become that person. This is the Christian Saints Podcast. Your hosts, priest Father Symeon Kees and layman James John Marks, discuss how the lives of the saints and the liturgical life of the Church can guide us on a spiritual examination of our own hearts, the journey of the way of the life of faithfulness to the Evangelion of Jesus, the Christ. Here is today's episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to continue our conversation of answering the question, where is the church? The last time Father Symeon and I spoke, we talked surprisingly and somewhat unexpectedly about our own stories of finding the church. And that let us highlight the question of historicity and the question of unity. And we're going to dive a little deeper into some more aspects of that question and the answer to that question today. Hello, Father Symeon. It's been a little while. I'm glad we were able to get this one in. I've got some travel coming up. I didn't want to have to take all my gear with me, so I'm glad we've got a chance to talk before I leave. It will make life quite a bit simpler. So thank you for making the time. I know you've been very busy lately.
It's great. I've been traveling too over the summer, but it's always great to get together.
So last time we read quite a bit from St. Ignatius of Antioch, and we talked about the role of the bishop in the church and the role of the priests in the church. So we sort of hinted at this question of apostolic succession, but truth be told, there are a number of institutions around the world today that all claim apostolic succession, and we know that the Eastern Orthodox Church has, shall we say, different views on whose claims are more valid than whose. That there are some groups that were the various schisms to be healed, we could recognize their succession as having continued despite the schism, and there are other groups where we would say no, that they would sort of have to be subsumed into us rather than reunite with us. And so it's a question we should probably get a little bit more specific about. I know you had highlighted some additional readings we didn't get to last time that I think we'll want to dive into today, but why don't you let us know where you'd like to start?
Okay, well, I guess we could begin with St. Irenaeus, if you have that reading with you.
I do have that reading here. Let me pull it up.
We've already read from St. Ignatius of Antioch, so let's read a little from St. Irenaeus.
Alrighty, and so this is from his text that's often referred to as Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 3, Section 4. And this is going to be about a man named Polycarp. Do we want to explain who Polycarp is before I read it or after?
We can talk about him before if you'd like to mention something about him.
I don't have anything necessarily near to hand, but I thought it might be useful for people to know who he is and thus why we're going to read about him. Maybe you could find something to explain that while I read it. And
well, it sort of explains a little bit, but St. Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna. Smyrna is in the book of Revelation. It's one of those churches that is mentioned in the book of Revelation. And St. Polycarp's martyrdom is one of the first recorded accounts of martyrdom that we have within the church. So it's if you read St. Polycarp's martyrdom, then we get insight into not only his personal life, but this practice that still is part of the church today of celebrating martyrs on the day of their martyrdom. Also, the keeping of relics, the keeping of the bones of the saints. This goes back very early. So we are going to hear from St. Ireneaus, who is a very early leader in the church, and St. Polycarp also was a very early leader in the church. Two people who kept the apostolic faith, passed on the apostolic faith. And it's part of this whole succession that we have, not only of apostolic succession of bishops, but really the passing on of the faith that we have in its totality, in its Catholicity. And Catholicity actually is about wholeness, about the wholeness of the faith and the wholeness of the church. So let's just read and let's hear about what St. Irenaeus has to say.
All righty. And I will say in passing, one of the epistles of St. Ignatius we read last time was to the church in Smyrna as well. So there's connections all through here. So section 4, chapter 3, book 3, Against Heresies by St. Ignatius. But Polycarp also was not only instructed by apostles and conversed with many who had seen Christ, but was also, by apostles in Asia, appointed bishop of the church in Smyrna, whom I also saw in my early youth, for he tarried on earth a very long time, and when a very old man, gloriously and most nobly suffering martyrdom, departed this life, having always taught the things which he had learned from the apostles, and which the church has handed down, and which alone are true. To these things all the Asiatic churches testify, as do also those men who have succeeded Polycarp down to the present time, a man who was of much greater weight and a more steadfast witness of truth than Valentinus and Marcion and the rest of the heretics. He it was who, coming to Rome in the time of Anicetus, caused many to turn away from the aforesaid heretics to the church of God, proclaiming that he had received this one and sole truth from the apostles, that, namely, which is handed down by the church. There are also those who heard from him that John, the disciple of the Lord, going to bathe at Ephesus and perceiving Cyrthanus within, rushed out of the bathhouse without bathing and exclaimed, "Let us fly, lest even the bathhouse fall down, because Cyrthanus, the enemy of the truth, is within." And Polycarp himself replied to Marcion, who met him on one occasion and said, "Do you know me?" "I do know you, the firstborn of Satan." Such was the horror which the apostles and their disciples had against holding even verbal communication with any corrupters of the truth. As St. Paul also says, "A man that is a heretic after the first and second admonition reject, knowing that he that is such is subverted and sins, being condemned of himself," which is from the 3rd chapter of the Epistle to Titus. There's also a very powerful epistle of Polycarp written to the Philippians, from which those who choose to do so are anxious about their salvation, can learn the character of his faith and the preaching of the truth. Then again, the church in Ephesus, founded by St. Paul, and having St. John remaining among them permanently until the time of Trajan, is a true witness of the tradition of the apostles. Unquote.
There we go. So here we have someone who lives near the time of the apostles, speaking about this passing on of faith. So we have the apostle John, Polycarp, Irenaeus, and this transmission of what we call the tradition, holy tradition or apostolic tradition. One way of defining that is really the whole faith that is passed down from generation to generation, that which is unchanging, that which it comes by revelation, passed down generation to generation to generation, whole and unchanged. And another way of understanding holy tradition is life in the Spirit, because those things come together, right? So in that sense, every generation is living this whole life of faith. It's not just a list of doctrines, but the entire apostolic faith passed down through the Holy Spirit and lived in every generation in the Holy Spirit within the church. So then we go back to the apostles and we see it passed on to the next generation, and it's passed on to the next generation, and it's passed on to the next generation. And that is this holy tradition that comes down to us. So this is especially, when we talk about holy tradition, especially applied to the bishops, that our bishops, their consecration as bishops, it goes back to the holy apostles. And then those bishops make more bishops to oversee churches. And those bishops also ordain priests and ordain deacons to care for those churches. And within the Orthodox Church, we have a succession with regard to the ordination of our bishops and our priests and our deacons. And we also have the passing down of truth. And I want to say something about what apostolic tradition isn't. And this is something that people listening may run across. And you can find somebody who is just out of nowhere claims to have apostolic tradition. And there are these weird genealogies. It's almost like, it's almost like wizardry. It's like, I have learned this magical tradition from this wizard who is the 135th student in this line. It's kind of weird, and it is. You see this in the martial arts too. There'll be some guy named Bob in Minnesota who is the disciple from this, supposedly from this ancient martial artist in a cave in China or something.
The guy that I studied with in Rhode Island, whose name was John Conroy and was clearly very Irish, he studied directly with a family in Hong Kong who, I mean, I saw all the various documents that they would put forward that they claimed this direct lineage to the heart of the Yang family and all that. Yeah, so it was a big thing with those sort of people.
Yeah, there's a lot of these sort of lineages, and sometimes, I mean, it's like biological lineage. I mean, which I'm kind of fascinated with family history. Those are very interesting. You wonder, though, I look at my ancestors, especially those who came here a very long time ago. We've been in the United States a long time ago, according to our records. How much do I really have in common with some of the ancestors that have been here? And their way of thinking and their culture, and that's certainly true. Even in the martial arts, if people learn a certain style technically, how much of that, a philosophy, especially if it's a deeper sort of inner tradition, martial arts tradition, how much of that has really been transmitted down. But when we apply this to claims of apostolic tradition, what you can find is some guy named Joe Bob or something, who claims apostolic tradition, who's like Pentecostal guy out there, and we'll have this story about receiving the laying on of hands from somebody who received the laying on of hands from somebody who received the laying on of hands from somebody who was maybe excommunicated from the Catholic Church or something like that, and claims to have some sort of apostolic succession. In Orthodoxy, in the ancient Church, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, even if you were to have an Orthodox bishop who lost his mind and ordained someone who was let's say like some kind of Pentecostal self-proclaimed bishop, that man can't go to his congregation the next day and then claim that he is now holds a priesthood in the apostolic tradition, because a part of apostolic tradition is having one's hands laid on by an Orthodox bishop. And this goes back to the Holy Apostles. But it's also, what is required is that the apostolic faith is passed on. In other words, that the one who receives ordination holds to the apostolic faith. And holding to the apostolic faith, it includes being part of the Apostolic Church, the Holy Orthodox Church. That is the Church of the Apostles. So if God forbid, if a priest leaves the Orthodox Church, is not in communion with the Orthodox Church anymore, with his Orthodox bishop, he's no longer holding the apostolic faith. He has bad ecclesiology if he does that. But he's not in communion with the church, where the apostolic succession is. So there's nothing apostolic about that man anymore. And he certainly can't join some other group and then claim that he has apostolic succession. It's not magic. And in America, we fall into all kinds of ways of thinking, into rationalism. And I mean, a lot of this often includes rationalism because people just rationalize it. And they have charts, and genealogies rationalizing these things in some kind of legalistic sort of way. We're not legalists. We're not rationalists. We're not sentimentalists. No matter how much you feel it's true, if it's not true, it's not true. And it's not magic. We are dealing with the true and living God, the Holy Spirit, with the Father and the Son. And we cannot play around with the mysteries for self-serving purposes. So if we want to find apostolic succession, if we want to find the true priesthood, if we want to find the true episcopacy, true leadership, if we want to find the true faith, which is, again, not doctrine, the whole faith, the whole tradition as the Christian life, the apostolic life in its fullness, lived in the Holy Spirit. And we find that within the church. And that is the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That is the Orthodox. That is where we find it.
What you were saying about the dual nature of apostolic succession being, on the one hand, lineage, but on the other hand, the preservation of the truth, immediately made me think of the prayer in the middle of the prayers that are said over the gifts that become the Eucharist. At one point in the middle of all that, the priest says, "Among the first, remember, O Lord, our great Lord and Father, is holiness." And then usually the bishop or the patriarch or the metropolitan, whoever's relevant to reference there, "Whom do thou grant unto thy holy churches in peace, safety, honor, health, and length of days, rightly dividing the word of thy truth." And then the response is, "And grant us with one mouth and one heart to glorify in him thy most honorable and majestic name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." And so there is linked directly to this idea of the preservation of the bishop is his role. And this is what you said last time when you talked about, because this role of bishop comes from going back to the passage in Ephesians that I read, where there's this funny hedge about the word pastor that's really shepherd, that our bishop is our shepherd, and that what does a shepherd do? They protect, but they also correct. And we talked about that a fair bit last time. And this is a huge part of that, is to truly be an apostolic bishop, a bishop in apostolic succession, you have to rightly divide the word of truth. And a huge part of that is keeping all of us in unity in the name of the Trinity, because that's where the truth is in this relationship to the one true God. Which is why guys like Marcion were heretics, because if you look at any of the major heretics, especially the early ones, there was some distortion of the Trinity going on, either by distorting the nature of the incarnation, which affects an aspect of the Trinity indirectly, or by distorting the Trinity itself, by saying that Jesus was created, or that the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament are different, or all these, these different things that we would run into that none of the apostles said, because that wasn't what was revealed to them.
Right. What I love about this reading, well, I love a lot of things. I have to say one thing I love about this reading, additionally to the fact that it gives us these steps going back to the apostles of apostolic succession, which still continues to get. We have to remember this, right? That the apostolic teaching held today within the Orthodox Church, which is the Church of St. Polycarp, Church of St. Irenaeus, is the same that was received from St. John, the apostle, right? So we have to remember that. But one thing I really like about this is notice how they just did not put up with heresy. And today, there are absolutely ridiculous heresies within the world, all kinds of heresies. And there's an expectation sometimes that we should compromise, that the Orthodox Church, for the sake of unity, that we should do what is often done among Protestant groups, and that is to de-emphasize teachings that are distinctive among denominations so that we can create sort of a minimalistic creed of the most basic aspects of Christianity that everybody can agree on. And I would say that with the major denominations today, those that were major denominations, mainline denominations, we hold very, very little in common with them, including Jesus, really, if we get down to it. I mean, the paper Jesus that is so thin in mainline denominations today, it's not even Christianity. It's no more Christianity than those groups that we would have called the 80s cults, the new religious movements, because and they were called cults, not in necessarily a sociological sense, although they started that way. And but a cult really can be defined as even from a Protestant perspective, which is rather accommodating sometimes, of a religion that is so far from any kind of accepted Christianity within Protestantism that they cannot be considered Christian at all. Like, for example, denial of the Holy Trinity. And I would say that many mainline denominations today, there is functionally a denial of the Trinity, of the divinity of Christ. And it really has trappings of Christianity, but really a whole different religion actually being practiced within. And that is a kind of a civic religion, an American civic religion.
It goes to what we talked about last season, where so much of the mainline has allowed the faith to become secondary to some driving ideology. And what's really at the center of that denomination at this point is a particular ideology. And then the doctrines and the theologies and the practices of that denomination are shaped to accommodate the ideology. And as you said, you end up with something that barely looks like Christianity.
Right. And it's easy to look at it and say, well, it's politics getting in there, but it's more than that. I mean, the culture war on the political level, underlying that are these competing ideologies, but those ideologies are today functioning as religion.
And what's crazy about that is that's happened over the course of over the course of our lifetime. Where, I mean, as I said, we talked last time about the traditions we grew up in, and the church that I grew up in is one of the arch sort of mainline denominations. And when I was a kid, it was still very much high church, and it was very conservative, and it looked a lot like Christianity, and it talked a lot like Christianity. And even just over the last couple of years, even some of my brothers and other members of my family have stopped attending that community because they want to continue to be Christians, and that tradition doesn't look anything like it did 50 years ago.
Right. There's no theological content there. And one could say, we really can go back. It didn't just appear. And one could really go back even into early America and look at even founding fathers that are functionally deists, really functionally Unitarian in some ways. And that kind of shaped an American, kind of an acceptable American civic religion that maybe Protestants don't notice so much, but as Orthodox we do, because it's so different. That American civic religion is not at all reflective of ancient faith. There's a certain maintaining of language, though, in which if one was a believing Protestant, or in many cases Roman Catholic or Orthodox, we would be at least familiar with the language. And it was sort of a thin civic religion in which even maybe being Jewish, one could hear it and it would not seem strange. It was accommodating sort of civic American language.
Something that I think can't be understated, because we've talked before about the so-called Pilgrims, the Puritans who colonized Massachusetts and other parts of what is now New England, were Calvinists, and were hardcore Calvinists. I mean, we say, oh, they came here for a new life. No, they were being exiled from a place where they had tried to kill kings. And because we are descended from them, we kind of whitewash what they were about. And we cannot understate the importance of the 30 Years' War in what changed between when they got here and when Thomas Jefferson et al. Founded our country. That there was a massive paradigm shift in the Protestant experiment in that brief period of time between those two events. And it stemmed from the horrors of the 30 Years' War and this realization in what we now call Europe, which at that time was originally Christendom, that the Roman Catholics and the Protestants couldn't spend eternity trying to kill each other or convert each other, or there weren't going to be any Christians left eventually. And so there was suddenly this idea of, well, maybe we can just put up with each other. And we'll have different nation states, and we'll have different, and this nation state will be Catholic, and this nation state will be Calvinist, and this nation state will be Lutheran. That was a completely novel concept for how to run a continent. And it's why we don't call it Christendom anymore, because they couldn't agree on what Christendom was, or is, or should be. And so they had to start calling it something else.
What is interesting is how much at least in some of the discourse, the idea of freedom of religion really had to do with different Protestant denominations.
Right. I mean, the Puritans did not believe in freedom of religion in the sense of everybody should be allowed to do what they want. It was, we should be allowed to do what we believe is right, but everybody who's here has to do what we do. Rhode Island was a penal colony for heretics out of Boston.
Right. And that was a time. It's interesting, as I mentioned, there's sort of this deistic use of language, very accommodating sort of language in the American experiment, in an environment in which people were very strong about their denominational distinctive. This really goes back to what I was saying is, I mean, today within Protestantism, to include as many people as possible, I mean, those distinctives don't even exist in many churches, right? I mean, you can call yourself whatever, you'd be part of a denomination or even have a denomination in your name, and it doesn't mean that you believe in anything close to what your actual founder did. So there's this minimalism, but as Orthodox, a part of holding the Apostolic Succession is that we preserve it and we protect it. And that is that means that we are maximalists. That we don't pare things down to an acceptable number of things that everybody can agree on. We keep the whole thing. And we keep the whole thing for the entire world. I mean, we call everyone who wants the fullness of the faith into the church to experience the full thing. When you come into the church, then it's not just adding more to what you previously believed. You do have a fullness that you didn't have before, but you also have a correction of those things that were false that you believed before. And you also have an affirmation of those things that were correct that you believed before. And that's true even if you were a pagan, right? That's one thing about Christianity, is that if you learned virtue, even as a pagan, that the church affirms that what you did get right. Because all truth belongs to the Christians. Because if you got it right, that came from the true and living God. And all of that is refined. And I'll say, as we talk about this, there's something that's very important in this world we live in, is because we have Christians out there who are Protestant, who are attracted to Orthodoxy because perhaps they see something online. And they think, well, I want to be Orthodox because I am tired of the sentimental, feminized worship, and I want something more masculine. Like that's a bad reason to become Orthodox. And there are a lot of bad reasons, right? Another is, contemporary worship. It's emotional and it's kind of a show, and I'm just tired of that. But I went into an Orthodox church and I smelled the incense and I saw this ancient worship, and I was just transported this other time and place. That's actually not a great reason to become Orthodox. I mean, these are true things. Another is, I grew up where God was sort of the judge who I felt was always judging me, and I come to Orthodoxy, and it's not about legalism. It's not legalistic. It's not primarily about a legal understanding of sin, but about sin as a self-inflicted wound on the soul, and it's all about healing. And that is attractive to me. And that's not a great reason to actually become Orthodox. It's true that Orthodoxy is about healing. We preserve that ancient understanding, but that's not a reason. And it's also not because I'm Roman Catholic and I don't like all the changes with Vatican II, or don't agree with papal supremacy. I watched a video and they convinced me of this Roman Catholic doctrine that is not correct, like the filioque. That's not a great reason to become Orthodox. And it's not right to avoid Orthodoxy because of something where one says, I prefer a different kind of worship, like preference, right? Some kind of sense of preference. Or I like Orthodoxy, but the emphasis on the Virgin Mary, I don't like that, or I don't understand it. Or icons, I watched this video on icons.
Or I like everything about it, but it's too patriarchal.
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't like the patriarchal structure, or, I'm not sure, like being a woman, if it's the best thing for me as a woman, and all of these things. And those are terrible reasons. Because the reason, or let me take it farther, if someone is not Christian and someone says, well, I appreciate Orthodoxy, but there are just things that I just can't hold on to, I can't believe, because I'm just, I'm very progressive. Or one might say there are these certain conservative ideals that I hold on to that I just don't see that. I think the church should be stronger about these things. Right? That's because you have an idol that you want to keep in your closet. It's like Israel saying, I want to follow the God of Israel, but can I keep my Baal statue in case we have a drought? The God of the storm. So those are terrible reasons. The reason that you should become Orthodox is because Christ is risen. And you understand what it means that Christ is risen, that he is life himself, that he destroys death, not only destroys at the end of the age mortality completely in the general resurrection, but that he destroys everything that is darkness and death and that is unnatural in the soul, that he is light himself. And he is the Lord of the living. When we understand that, we should be Orthodox because of that. And to understand that the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, that it is the church founded by Jesus Christ, the only church that really can be called properly in every way church, that didn't come from something else, from a break in another church, but was founded by Christ himself, upon his holy apostles, that keeps the fullness of the apostolic way, the whole Christian life, whole and undefiled since the apostles, today in 2026, as it was in the time of Christ and the apostles. That is the reason to become Orthodox. And if you become Orthodox for that reason, because it is the church of Jesus Christ on earth, that it is the place where it is the church. I'll say this. It is the church. Then you find there the true worship of the true and living God in heaven that has been revealed to man. You find the true doctrines. You find the true way of life that leads to the fullness of the kingdom of heaven and to us being who we have been called to be as human beings, as men and women. If you become Orthodox for the right reason, all of those other things are true, and you find that. But that's what we need in life. I said before, I think, that we don't need to find the right church for us. We need to find the right church. And that's what it's all about. The reason I became Orthodox is because the Orthodox Church is the church founded by Jesus. And that's true of all of us. And if we want that apostolic succession, we get it just by uniting to the church founded by Jesus Christ. If you have to have some kind of complicated genealogy, then you're not in the right place. People are just trying to rationalize it.
So are you going to preach that again this Sunday too? Because I think you did when we recorded 3 weeks ago. So,
well, we have to keep reminding ourselves.
That's true.
Of this fact. No, because this is what apostolic succession is. This is where we find it. This is where we find the Orthodox bishop.
And I want to be careful because we could take a whole bunch of time, because there are 4 or 5 groups that claim to be the church, that claim apostolic succession, and we could sort of go through them and explain why in each case they haven't rightly divided the word of truth, and that's why they're not, and we are. I don't know that that's a helpful thing to do, but I do want to acknowledge the Eastern Orthodox Church is not the only church that claims to be the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church and claims apostolic succession. There are other groups that make the same claim. And there are, in every one of those cases, more or less efforts between the groups to figure out how we could become one without compromising the truth. And so I want to acknowledge that, but I don't know that we necessarily want to get into the polemics of why we're right and they're wrong. I mean, I'll leave that up to you, but I don't know how helpful that is for the kind of audience that we have at this time.
No, and what I just said is the point, but it is also prologue. And I think this is what we have to talk about is we don't find the church, if we're looking for the church, by going on YouTube and watching people argue about theological points. A much less sentimental point. in which we say, this is Orthodox worship, in which we have a video of an Orthodox service, usually accompanied by chant. And it's very smoky and it's dark and the candles are going. And it's all about, the ancientness of the church. And then it is shown beside perhaps a Protestant contemporary worship service in which the lights are going, everywhere. And there's the praise band and all of that. And that's a very sentimental sort of thing to say, see, which do you think is more reverent? It's Orthodox worship, right?
It's lazy rhetoric. It's funny because it's right, but it's at the end of the day, it's a cheap shot. It was something I appreciated that you and I brought up last time, that people need to be careful not to despise the things that help them get where they are now. And I think it was a big part of why we wanted to share our story. Yes, I left the United Methodist Church, but it wasn't because I hated the United Methodist. I left it because it taught me enough, and then where I went to college taught me enough that I could find the church. And I'm deeply grateful to what I learned in the United Methodist Church. I'm deeply grateful for what I learned in the time that I was in the Roman Catholic Church and all my Roman Catholic relatives. Without those things, I wouldn't be here now. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. I mentioned at the beginning of the show, I'm going to be traveling. I'm going home to visit family. I'm going to go see my parents. I'm going to go see my brothers. And yeah, I'll visit an Orthodox church that's in the area there, but I will probably also go to services with at least somebody from my family somewhere. When we visit my wife's family out in Phoenix, we go back and forth because we're there for multiple weeks. 1 week we'll go to the Orthodox Church. We'll go with them to the tradition that they're in. And there are good things there. I can sit there and be a jerk and name all the ways in which it's incomplete, but there are good things there. And I think there is a level on which, when we engage with people in other traditions, if we want to do any good to help them, as you said, find the church and want to be in the church, which is what we should be, if we're doing it right, that's what we should want to be doing, because as you said, that's the point. If we want to do that well, we're so better served to look at a tradition that someone else is in and identify all the things about it that are good and say, okay, you have that. Doesn't that make you want more? Doesn't that feel like it's not enough? It's an interesting thing. People get so wound up polemically about what is salvation, and you get these arguments about sola fide, and you get arguments about works righteousness and Pelagianism, and all of it's oversimplified and historically inaccurate anyway. And at the end of the day, I've gotten to the point where I just tell people, okay, so you said a prayer and you think you repented and you think you're a Christian now and you think you're saved. Does that really feel like enough to know and love God for the rest of your life? Does that really feel like, do you really feel like that's job done? Because if so, then there's nothing I can tell. Like, if that is true for you, then there's nothing I can say. There's no way I'm going to convince you to move past that. But if that's really meant something to you, I think deep down you're going to realize you want more. And the tradition you're in isn't giving you any more. And so can we help you find something that, yes, you have some truth, but there's a more complete truth? Can we get you to that? Are you interested in that? Because if you're not, what's the point of arguing?
Yeah. My alma mater, Asbury Theological Seminary, has apparently been recently delisted as an acceptable seminary for the United Methodist Church. And it's because Asbury, they still know what a man is, a woman is, and what marriage is. So I'm thankful for the education I received there at a traditional Methodist seminary. I say the Methodism, if you follow it, Wesleyanism, the trajectory of Wesleyanism will lead you to the Orthodox Church. I mean, if you really understand what the trajectory of what John Wesley was preaching, because it really is theosis. When you take Orthodox theology and put it in a Western Ordo Salutis, order of salvation, a Western doctrinal framework, it distorts it. But if you follow it, it will lead you to orthodoxy. And I'm very thankful for my education that I received. I'm thankful for my secular education in religious studies. I was taught things that some of it was nuts. But I sensed some of it was crazy. Like, just, it didn't seem like I was getting the whole story. So then I started doing research, trying to figure out the whole story. And I discovered, eventually ancient texts close to the apostles that were being completely ignored in favor of modern scholars who I don't think knew church history. I think they just had like a biblical text. Sometimes I wonder if they read the Bible, but I think, had the biblical text, and they were kind of in a vacuum. Of course, that type of bad scholarship is kind of the child of sola scriptura in a lot of ways. But the point of talking all about this is that, first of all, I'm happy if anybody watches a YouTube video and people are arguing about doctrine. Sometimes they're not very good because the people representing Orthodoxy don't understand Orthodoxy very well or have a very deep experience of it. If they did, they probably wouldn't be arguing doctrine, but in many cases. But if that leads you to Orthodoxy, then I'm thankful that led you to Orthodoxy. So there are times people watch videos that I would not recommend, and it leads them to the church. And thank God that it leads them to the church. What I want and what I hope for is that people, when they come to the church, that they will be refined and that they will continue to learn, and in some cases unlearn what they previously thought, and that they will continue to grow, and they will grow with a faith that is rooted in the person of Jesus Christ. That they don't come to the church remaining someone who came to the church because I watched this video and I think Orthodoxy has a better understanding of this idea. You need to get past the attachment to the idea and really have faith in the person of Jesus Christ. And because the church is his body, and there you find the church that is the pillar and ground of truth, the temple of the Holy Spirit. And that's real faith.
Yeah, we've said before that salvation is something that really takes your whole life. To move, as we always say on this show, and it's the journey of the way of the life of faithfulness. That's salvation. And if Orthodoxy is the church and salvation is found in the church, then in the same way, converting to Orthodoxy also takes your whole life. Whatever thing is the thing that got you started attending, and then whatever was the thing that got you to enter into communion and become a member, you're not Orthodox yet. I've been doing this for 15 years and I still have a lot to learn. And I don't mean like read more books. I mean digging into the muck inside of me and getting rid of the muck. Because the more I do this, the more muck I figure out is in there. When I was going through the process of trying to find the church over the first, half of my adult life, I was one of those people that was like, yeah, I'm pretty much a pretty good person. I didn't see my faults when I was 25, when I was 30 years old. And the irony is, now that I'm in the church and I've been working on these things very actively, very explicitly, I talked about that, the work I've done in therapy, the work I've done in confession. And again, I have a long way to go. I'm still a jerk. I'm more than happy to admit that. But I'm trying not to be. And 25, 30 years ago, I wasn't necessarily trying not to be a jerk because I didn't know I was a jerk. And I was more of a jerk then than I am now. And I didn't know it. Part of why I was so bad was that I didn't know that I wasn't basically a good person. I was basically a lousy person, but I didn't know it. And so, yeah, I entered into the life of the church 15 years ago, which, that's a late start. I was almost 40 years old, right? And so I was 40 years behind the curve, right, to get anywhere with this. And this is why I'm grateful when people offer me a wish for many years, because I need them, because I'm 40 years behind schedule. And I started out at age 40 a jerk instead of just like a little kid who's going to grow up in the church and maybe have some hope of not developing deep-seated bad habits over the course of their life. Everybody does, but I'm grateful for what I was given. But there's, like I said, I love to watch children in church, mostly because it gives me hope that there will be people in this country 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 100 years from now, where this is all they've known. And their ability to share that with the people around them will be so much more effective than me, because it will just simply be who they are. They'll have been infused with it for their whole life. And I love watching kids grow up in the parishes that I attend. They look so different than I did when I was that age. How they think, how they talk, how they behave, how they interact with other people, how they talk. It's not like how I was. And that's a good thing.
Yeah. The life of the church is about being infused with grace, and that life of the Spirit becoming our comprehensive entire way of life, which is different from an typical American way of thinking, in which we talk about religion as though it's a part of our life. We like to compartmentalize, and like we have a cabinet with a series of drawers, and religion is one of those drawers. And sometimes our relationships is another drawer. That creates problems. And those categories don't exist. I mean, there really is no such thing as secular space for Orthodox.
It's a product of the 19th century. The modernism, capital M modernism, categorized and siloed and compartmentalized absolutely most of what we think of now as academic subjects weren't separate and isolated from one another 300, 400 years ago. That happened 200 years ago.
Yeah. We have a tendency today to treat in Christianity, culturally, in some places, like it is under this ideological civic religion, this sort of like vague paganism. So you can be a Christian. You should be able to go to your church and worship. But that's kind of like religion is a private thing. And religion is not a private thing. I mean, part of being a Christian is it's not a private thing. It is the way we have to live our life in all of our relationships. And it's not like there are these human rights or something that is above Christianity. That we can be Christian as long as we kind of believe these other set of doctrines from this other religion that is more powerful in our society, more pervasive in our society. Because we just say no, we don't. And if it is good, then it is contained within the faith.
You and I have joked that we like to make fun of the French on this show, but one thing that I will give them credit for, they are more honest than the United States is about their civil religion, because they have a Trinity, and it's not the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. It's liberté, égalité, and fraternité. And they're very honest about that, at least, that is now their Trinity. And they take that very seriously. And we're no different, but we still put in God we trust on the money and argue about whether we are or aren't a Christian country, despite the fact that, as you said, we were founded by a bunch of guys who believed in milquetoast deism.
Yeah, I mean, if we really want to understand the West, then we have to understand the French Revolution. If I want to say have to understand, because there are other ways, but understanding the French Revolution and the progression of the French Revolution and the attempt to replace the Christianity that they knew, which was not ancient and apostolic Christianity, but the Christianity that they knew, with some kind of vague deism or atheism, a reason itself as a principle. that has tremendously affected not only the United States, but the Western world. And this really goes back, since you mentioned the French. This Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, by the way.
To be fair, we started with a French guy.
Yeah, the ancient Gaul. So this is the alternative to what I've talked about. I've mentioned bad reasons to become Orthodox, bad reasons to figure out whether one should be Orthodox and whether the Orthodox Church is the church. But the alternative to that is this philosophical, systematic approach in which we judge ideas based upon whatever ideology or perspective we have now here in 2026. For some of us, we have an ideology that's very new, decades old. Some people have a particular lens with which they see Christianity in the early church that is 500 years old-ish, going back to the Reformation. Some maybe 1,000 years old, going back really to the development of what we would call today, with quotes, Western Christianity. But we have to go all the way back. And this is something that I've probably talked about maybe several times in this podcast. But to understand the church, we need to understand it in the context of the history that is the spiritual story of God's work in humanity. And if we we start at the resurrection does two things. It is a good beginning place, provides a good beginning place for going to the apostles and Pentecost and the story of the church. But it also takes us back, especially if we understand the resurrection in terms of the beginning of the Gospel of John, which it starts with the incarnation, but takes us to the resurrection. And that resurrection really takes us back to where John begins in the beginning. And that takes us back to the beginning of creation, because the resurrection is a new creation. We have the new Adam doing the work of the new Adam. We go back to the old Adam. But it takes us back to the very beginning of history. And we can start the story there, follow the story through the Old Testament to Christ, to the New Testament, the history of the church. Or we can start with Christ and his resurrection and go through the history of the church, wherever it's one story, wherever we start. And we understand the church as this continuation. The Acts of the Apostles is not the fullness of the story. Right? We start out with in Jerusalem, where people are there from all over the place for this feast, this Jewish feast. And the Holy Spirit comes and we have this preaching, and the gospel is now going out. We have all these people gathered there. And at Babel, the people were scattered through the confusion of languages. And now people are brought together, united from all over the world with the preaching that unites through language, through this miracle, Pentecost. And now the gospel is going to go out to all the places these people are from. And we have all these people in Jerusalem, and they're sharing everything. And it's sort of like church camp. If somebody needs something, people are selling, and they're sort of like, it's like the holy version of Woodstock, right? It's like the sanctified version of people coming together, united in truth and taking care of one another. But it doesn't stop there. The apostles go out and they take the gospel all over the world. And we see the mission, especially in the life of St. Paul, in the Acts of the Apostles, but it doesn't stop there. Like, it keeps going, this mission. And the missionary activity continues. And then, for example, you have the Greeks taking the gospel to the Rus. And you have the establishment of the Russian Orthodox Church. I'm skipping way through history, right? But the Russians bring that faith to Japan. It ends up going through into China, into Alaska, Siberia, into Alaska, which was then part of Russia and then became part of the United States. They're sending missionaries into the United States. And Antioch, this ancient church, we're going to celebrate our patron saints, Peter and Paul, soon. They brought the gospel here through their lives, immigration. And St. Raphael of Brooklyn came here to gather those lost sheep of America. Who were the lost sheep of America? Those are the Syrian and the Lebanese who were part of the ancient church of Antioch in Acts who came here. And he's going around, he's gathering them together. And it's just incredible, all of this happening.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. This has been a joint production of Paradosis Pavilion and Generative Sounds. Father Symeon is assigned to St. Raphael Antiochian Orthodox Christian Church in Iowa City. James John is serving his parish of All Saints Antiochian Orthodox Christian Church in Chicago by reading and chanting. If this podcast has been edifying for you, please subscribe so that we know you are listening, and share this program with someone you believe will also enjoy it. We would love to hear from you through our social media platforms or on our YouTube channel. Please forgive us our shortcomings and pray for us.